It looks like some big changes are coming to the state's transit systems over the next few months. MBTA officials have long warned of the possibility of service cuts as the pandemic drags on, and yesterday they unveiled their proposal. As soon as January, they're looking to completely eliminate ferry service to Charlestown, Hull, and Hingham. They also want to end weekend commuter rail service, halt weekday service on most lines around 9 p.m., close 6 stations, and run fewer trains each day. Then in the spring, the T would start running fewer trains as well and end service at midnight. And in the summer, bus service would end at midnight as well. 25 routes would be eliminated. Fewer buses would run overall. Management says they tried as much as possible to maintain service for those who need it most while balancing the realities of a nearly $600 million anticipated budget shortfall by 2022. But others are raising big concerns about how the proposals will ultimately affect people and their employment. That said, none of this is final until the board votes on it next month, and there's a public comment period before that. So joining me with some public comments now are Tracy Corley. She's Transit Development Fellow at the nonpartisan think tank MassINC. Chris Dempsey, Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, a coalition of organizations aiming to improve transportation across the state. Chris, good to see you. Tracy, good to meet you.
Hey, you too, Jim.
Chris, starting with you, the numbers sound disturbing, but they're just numbers, which I don't think mean much to people. What's the real world impact of these proposed reductions or eliminations of service?
These are drastic and dramatic cuts. And my message tonight is really clear, Jim, that the MBTA is an essential service. We need to treat it as such and fund it as such. There are still hundreds of thousands of people riding the T every single day. It's the person that's checking you out at the grocery store. It's the receptionist who's checking you in at the doctor's office. We want those people to be able to access their jobs safely. We want them to do it on vehicles that are not overly crowded. And these cuts are putting that all at risk.
Tracy, do you share that perspective?
100%. I think that not only are we thinking about those essential workers, we're also thinking about, other reasons why people are getting around, getting to healthcare appointments, going to go take care of family and friends, because there are people who are actually serving as caregivers in more than one location. People who still have to go to school and actually participate in the education system. We have a number of people who really rely on transit, and the pandemic is actually pushing more people into the category of folks who are relying on transit as their wages are getting cut, as they're losing their jobs. So we need to make sure that we keep this essential service there. I mean, it's like rationing electricity just because you go on vacation for a couple of months. We need to make sure that this essential service stays there.
Well, but and by the way, emotionally, I am totally with both of you, but Tracy, staying with you for a second. Correct these numbers if I'm wrong. A commuter rail and the subway, the T, from what I understand, somewhere in the 10 to 15% range of what ridership was pre-pandemic. I think buses, I know how Chris loves buses, roughly in the 40% range. But with dramatic reduction in ridership, what are they supposed to do? Just keep the same level of service even though the demand is nowhere near what it used to be? Is that what they have to do?
Well, part of the challenge is that we're basing how we plan our transportation on today's ridership, when in reality, we should be actually thinking about our transportation service as an essential service, because this pandemic will end. Unfortunately, the cuts that they're making today are going to be very hard to reverse once the pandemic is over. So, just because, ridership is down now, it is like I say, turning off your electricity because you go off on vacation and then having to come back and pay for those connection charges and do all the work from scratch again. I mean, this is going to be, we're going to have to think about the long-term effects of the cuts that we're making today because of the drops in ridership.
Chris, you both used the word essential services, but I want to seize on something Tracy said a second ago. It sounds to me that part of your concern, correct me if I'm wrong, is not just what the immediate impact is. I'm not downplaying that, but your concern is once it's cut, it's difficult to build it back. Is that part of the foundation for your angst about this?
That's exactly right. Nobody is advocating for the MBTA to run empty trains and buses. We all want the system to be more efficient. But some of these lines, once you cut them, some of these employees, once you lay them off, they never come back. And what we're left with is a region where, as the economy does start to come back and people start to get back to work, more and more people are driving on the road, fewer people are taking transit, And we don't even just have the congestion we had in January and February. It's even worse than it was. So as we think about economic recovery, we know that transit is essential to that also. And we want to make sure that the MBTA isn't cutting so deeply that we will perpetually have a system that's a fraction of the size that it once was.
So, Chris, when you just said the term cutting so deeply, does that mean that you aren't saying that no cuts are appropriate, but these are the wrong cuts and they're too deep? Is that where you're going?
Yeah, look, nobody is saying that we should take the MBTA schedule we had in February and freeze it in amber and just have that forever. Mm-hmm. It's appropriate for the MBTA and its leadership to be looking at how they can run the system more efficiently, where there are appropriate changes to make. That's a reasonable conversation to have. But the cuts that we're talking about here are up to a third of all MBTA commuter rail service. It's all of the ferry service. It's 25 bus lines. Those are deep, deep cuts, and we need the state legislature to step into this conversation to provide the resources to the MBTA that will help avoid the worst of those cuts.
So, Tracy, is that in the offing? I mean, this state legislature essentially, it seems to me, has gone home for the pandemic. They've done nothing on anything that matters, from keeping small businesses alive, including restaurants. The police reform bill is still languishing in a conference committee. There was early talk pre-pandemic of raising revenues for transportation. That has disappeared. Is it naive to suggest that either this legislature or this dysfunctional Congress will ultimately provide funds that would make these cuts unnecessary?
Well, these cuts would not be necessary if we already had those funding packages in place. This whole revenue generation conversation has been punted through multiple legislatures. And so here at the state level, we cannot wait for a federal bailout. We have to actually make the commitments now. And let me also add, we at MassINC have been advocating for cutting commuter rail fares, because one of the reasons why the trains are running empty is because people who live in our gateway cities and similar communities can't afford to ride the commuter rail. When your median household income is as low as $19,500 a year, how are we going to pay for a commuter rail pass or that $25 round trip into downtown Boston? So I think that, if they were to actually cut the fares, at least in half, they could actually get more riders on those trains today for those people who are now sitting 4 or 5 hours on the bus.
Tracy, I totally buy that thinking, but getting back to your first notion, I know Chris feels the same way about returning to the revenue packages that they have abandoned, but can't a credible argument be made the worst time to raise revenue from people is when they're or underemployed because of this pandemic?
Well, I think that, right now, the way that our revenue system is structured, we're relying upon the lower and middle classes to fund the state. Yeah. There are things that we could be doing to make our system more progressive and more equitable. And there are a lot of industries that are out there that are doing very, very well. And a lot of people who are profiting right now. There are a lot of places where business is up 70, 80, more than 100%. But still, we aren't going to be seeing additional corporate tax revenue from that.
Chris Dempsey, we only have a minute left. I remember, like it was a century ago, talking to you and your colleague, former Transportation Secretary Jim Aloisi, about how the only good out of a pandemic is it gives an opportunity to rethink how we do things. And I think both of you guys were optimistic about that happening. Charlie Baker is a really smart guy. Stephanie Pollack, Secretary of Transportation, a really smart woman. Is any of that kind of thinking going on?
I'm seeing that from both of them when it comes to, for example, supporting municipalities to make changes to streets, to have more outdoor dining, to have more space for walkers and cyclists. And I think those are great. We're not seeing that when it comes to the MBTA. We're seeing large cuts. I do understand that the T wants to be thoughtful with its budget and it wants to be as smart as it can, but we need to see more leadership from the governor and from the legislature to provide more resources to the T. It's not just revenue that does it. You could also look at the rainy day fund. Right. But either way, we need to step in to support the T because it is essential.
Tracy Corley, Chris Dempsey, thanks for your work and thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
You can find more information about the proposals and leave your own feedback about the plan online at the address on your screen, mbta.com/forging-ahead.